Elena Reyes flinched at the bell over the diner door the way she flinched at everything loud. A full-body jolt, gone in half a second, buried under a tired smile before anyone could clock it. She'd had 11 months to perfect that smile. Long enough that even she almost believed it some mornings, standing at the pass with a pot of burnt coffee in one hand, watching the door the way other waitresses watch the clock. What nobody in that diner knew was that the same reflex that made her drop a coffee pot when a truck backfired outside also let her clock, before conscious thought caught up, exactly where a gunshot in that room would come from and exactly who it would hit. It was a strange kind of fluency, the kind you don't choose and can't unlearn, the geometry of a room translating itself into cover, exposure, blind spots before she'd even finished pouring a refill. The man who walked in first didn't look like trouble. He looked like money, dark wool coat, unhurried stride, a sleeping infant girl tucked against his shoulder with a tenderness that seemed too soft for the width of his shoulders. Behind him, a second man's hand drifted toward the inside of his jacket, and his eyes weren't on the baby. They were on the door. Elena's body understood the room half a beat before her mind did. Weight distribution, sight line, angle, table for two, or is the little one joining the count? She said because she learned a long time ago that a calm voice bought you time nobody else knew you needed. The man with the baby. Later she'd learn his name was Dante Marchetti, and later still she'd wish she hadn't. Gave her a look that lasted exactly 1 second too long, like he was recalibrating something. Booth in the back, he said, facing the door. Of course he wanted to face the door. Men like him always did. It was the other one, the one trailing him, who worried her, the one whose jacket sat wrong over his ribs, whose eyes kept sliding to the window like he was waiting on something arriving, not someone leaving. She sat them in the back booth anyway. She topped off water glasses at the counter, refilled a sugar caddy nobody had asked her to refill, wiped down a section of counter that was already clean, small, useless motions that let her keep her eyes moving without looking like a woman doing math. But she was doing math. Distance to the booth, distance to the door. The 2 beats it would take the second man's hand to clear his jacket once his nerve caught up with his orders. The half-second lag between intention and action that she'd once been trained to exploit, and it's been a year trying to forget she knew how to read. The door chimed again. A third man walked in wrong. Wrong pace, wrong stillness, both hands visible in a way that screamed rehearsal, the particular stiffness of someone who has practiced looking harmless and gotten it almost but not quite right. Get down, Elena said, not loud, not a request. Nobody got down. Civilians never do the first time. So when the gun cleared the third man's coat and swept toward the booth where a sleeping baby lay against her father's chest, Elena was already moving, already between the muzzle and the bassinet-shaped bundle of blanket, already deciding with the flat, wordless certainty of someone who has made this decision before that her body was simply going to be in that space instead of empty air. The shot took her low in the side. It felt less like pain and more like being shoved by something enormous, a full-body concussion of force that emptied her lungs before the actual burning arrived a half-second later, right on schedule, exactly the way she remembered it arriving the last time. CTA, if you think you know where this is going, you're about to be wrong twice before the hour's up. Stay with her. She didn't fall so much as fold. One hand braced on the booth's edge, the other clamped instinctively over the wound at an angle that would have meant nothing to anyone in that diner, except that it was exactly the angle a combat medic uses to slow bleeding from that precise location, a detail that would matter enormously later and that nobody in the room was in any position to notice yet. The world had gone very loud and very far away at the same time, sound arriving late like it was swimming through water to reach her. Dante Marchetti's men descended on the shooter with the brutal efficiency of people who had done this before. Not panic, not chaos, but something rehearsed and cold, 3 men moving like gears in a machine that had been built for exactly this. Dante himself dropped to one knee beside Elena, the baby now screaming in the crook of his other arm, his voice gone low and clipped in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with control. Somebody get her to Alvarez. Now, she needs a hospital, said one of his men, young, jittery, knew enough to still say things like that out loud. She needs Alvarez, Dante said again, and something in the flatness of his voice ended the conversation. They didn't ask Elena what she wanted. Nobody asked women who bled on diner floors what they wanted. They were lifted, carried, moved through a kitchen and out a service door and into the back seat of a black car with the brisk, wordless efficiency of cargo with a pulse. Elena let them, because arguing cost blood she didn't have to spare, and because some old training she'd buried under a waitress' apron and 11 months of quiet was already telling her, distantly, that this family did not call ambulances. That told her something. She filed it away instead of asking, the way she'd learned to file away every detail that didn't need answering yet. In the back seat, pressed against leather that smelled like cedar and gun oil, Dante looked at her the way you look at a puzzle piece that's the wrong shape for the hole you're trying to fit it into. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "Neither did the guy who shot me," Elena said through her teeth, and did not explain the flinch that came a half-second later, small and involuntary and gone before he could name it, or the way her free hand had already found the pressure point on her own wrist without her telling it to. The private physician's office wasn't marked with any sign, tucked behind a locksmith shop in a part of the city where the streetlights worked and nobody asked why. Dr. Alvarez worked out of a converted brownstone with blackout curtains and a filing cabinet that Elena would have bet good money contained more secrets than medical records. He cut her shirt open with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times for people who couldn't afford to exist in a hospital's paperwork. "No sedation until you've assessed for internal bleeding," Elena said, before the doctor had even reached for the syringe on his tray. Everyone in the room went still. "Excuse me?" Alvarez said. "Pressure's dropping faster than blood loss alone explains. Check the exit wound before you check the entry." Her voice had gone somewhere flat and procedural, a register that had nothing to do with 3 years of carrying coffee pots, and everything to do with something older, something she hadn't used out loud in 11 months and hated hearing come back so easily, the way an old language comes back the moment you're dropped back into the country that speaks it. Alvarez checked. She was right. A slow, quiet bleed along a path the entry wound alone wouldn't have suggested, the kind of thing you only catch if you already know to look for it. Dante, standing in the doorway with his daughter finally asleep again against his shoulder, said nothing, but his eyes had narrowed in the specific way of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "Where," he said slowly, "does a waitress learn to talk like that? Where does a father know a doctor who doesn't ask for insurance cards?" Elena shot back, and the pain in her side made the words sharper than she meant them. Nobody answered that either. "CTA, you noticed that too, didn't you? 2 questions, and neither one gets answered yet. Keep that in your pocket." She spent 3 days in a guest room in the Marchetti compound recovering, a room too large and too quiet, with a window that looked out over a lawn manicured to the point of unreality and a door that locked from the outside as often as it didn't. Every one of those days, Marchetti's chief enforcer, a broad, unsmiling man named Salvo, found a reason to be near her door, straightening a picture frame that didn't need straightening, checking a lock that had already been checked. On the 3rd day, he stopped pretending it was coincidence. "You're not a plant," he said, arms crossed, filling the doorway, because a plant would have let the kid die and gone for Dante instead. A plant doesn't take a bullet for the wrong target. "But you're not just a waitress either. So which lie do you want me to believe?" "The one where I go back to work Thursday," Elena said, and closed the door on him, and did not sleep well that night because Salvo wasn't wrong, and she knew it better than anyone in that house. The days blurred into a strange convalescence. Alvarez checking her stitches each morning with a raised eyebrow, he never voiced into a question. A cook named Marisol who left extra bread on her tray, without being asked. A nursery down the hall, where a baby's cries occasionally drifted through the walls and made Elena's hand curl instinctively around the edge of the blanket, as if she could still be standing between something and a doorway, even from 2 rooms away. Word of the shooting had already spread through the kind of channels that don't print retractions. By the time Elena was upright and steady enough to walk the hallway unassisted, the story circulating through 3 rival families wasn't Marchetti's daughter survived an attempt. It was Marchetti is vulnerable enough that someone tried. A man named Cassano, whose name Elena heard whispered in the kitchen more than once, was reportedly already testing the theory, probing old alliances to see which ones had loosened. Dante found her on the compound's east terrace, where she'd gone to breathe air that didn't smell like antiseptic, the late afternoon light turning the frost on the grass to something almost gold. He didn't sit. He didn't do the thing men in his position usually did, which was make a decision and inform you of it afterward. "I want to marry you," he said, publicly, within the week. Elena laughed, once disbelieving. "You don't even know my last name." "Reyes," he said. "I know it. I know you have no family in this state, no landlord who'll miss you, and no explanation for the fact that you assessed a gunshot wound like you'd seen 100 of them. None of that is why I'm asking." "Then why?" "Because right now half the city thinks I'm bleeding out politically, and the only thing that stops men like Cassano from testing that theory is if the woman who took a bullet for my daughter is an employee I can be pressured into abandoning. She's family. Family isn't a liability. Family is a wall." His eyes flicked, briefly, toward the nursery window above them, and she already proved she'd stand where the wall needed standing. It was, Elena understood distantly, the least romantic marriage proposal in the history of marriage proposals, and also the first one she'd ever gotten that treated her competence as an asset instead of a threat. Every man before this one had wanted her softer, quieter, less alert. This one wanted her exactly as sharp as she was, and had simply found a use for the blade. "And if I say no, then I find another way to keep my daughter's life from being a bargaining chip. And you go back to a diner where the next man who walks in wrong might not miss." She said yes before she let herself examine why it felt less like a cage door closing and more like being handed, for the first time in 11 months, a job she was actually built for. CTA, a proposal with no romance in it at all. Write that down. It's going to matter later. Not everyone in the family greeted the announcement with the same calm. Rico Marchetti, Dante's cousin and the family's second-in-command for 11 years, went pale in a way that had nothing to do with concern for the family's optics and everything to do with something Elena couldn't name yet. A fury too specific, too personal to be about politics at all. She caught it only for a second, across a crowded dining room, before he smoothed his face back into the practiced neutrality of a man who'd spent a decade learning to hide exactly this. "You're marrying a diner waitress," Rico said to Dante, low and furious, in a hallway he didn't realize Elena could hear from around the corner. "You don't know what she is." "I know what she did," Dante said. "That's enough for me." "It shouldn't be," Rico said, and walked away before either of them could ask him what he meant. Elena stood very still in the shadow of the hallway a long moment after his footsteps faded, turning the sentence over. "It shouldn't be." Not the words of a man worried about family reputation. The words of a man who already knew something Dante didn't. She said nothing about it yet. She had learned, a long time ago, that the smartest thing you could do with a suspicion was let it sit exactly where it was until it was strong enough to survive being spoken out loud. The wedding was small, fast, and armed. Elena wore a borrowed dress and a bandage under it that nobody but Alvarez knew about. And when Dante slid a ring on her finger in front of 40 men who could kill her without raising their voices, she understood with total clarity that this was not a love story yet. It was a fortification. Whatever it became after that was still unwritten. Somewhere near the back of the room, Rico raised a champagne glass with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, and Elena, watching him over Dante's shoulder, filed that away too. In the weeks that followed, the fortification began, slowly and without either of them quite naming it, to develop cracks that let something else through. Dante started coming to the terrace at the same hour she did, not by arrangement, just habit finding its own gravity. He asked her opinion on things he had no obligation to ask her opinion on: a shipment route, a seating arrangement, the particular stubborn set of his daughter's jaw when she refused a bottle. Elena found herself answering honestly, which surprised her more than anything else about the last month had. It was 3 weeks after the wedding, in the compound's private clinic during a routine check on her healing wound, that the fortification cracked open into something else entirely. CTA. This is the part repeat listeners think they've already guessed. They haven't. Alvarez was reviewing her scar tissue when his brow furrowed at the pattern of an older injury beneath it. a puckered line along her ribs that predated the diner by years, silvered with age in a way the fresh wound wasn't. Field suture, he said, almost to himself, angling the light. Combat pattern, not civilian. Whoever closed this knew exactly what they were doing under pressure. No proper kit. Working fast. Who taught you to close a wound like that? Elena's silence lasted 1 second too long. I did, she said finally. On myself. 3 years ago, outside a compound in a country I'm not going to name, after an operation that officially never happened, run by a unit that officially doesn't exist, that ended with 16 of my people dead and every official report blaming a medic, me, for a triage decision I never made. Dante, who had walked in halfway through the sentence and gone utterly still in the doorway, said nothing for a long moment. The baby monitor on the counter crackled faintly with the sound of his daughter, sleeping 2 rooms away, an absurdly domestic soundtrack for the moment the floor shifted under all 3 of them. You were a combat medic, he said. Army Special Operations, attached medical. I went underground after the inquiry because the men who actually made the call that got my unit killed needed someone to have made it instead, and a decorated medic with no family to ask questions was convenient. Her hands, steady through a bullet wound and a wedding and 11 months of silence, were shaking now. A small betrayal she couldn't quite stop. That's why you knew the trajectory, Dante said slowly, pieces sliding into place with an almost audible click. Why you knew Alvarez over hospital. Why you didn't hesitate. That's why I did all of it, Elena said. None of it was an accident. I've just been very good at making it. Rico's fury at the wedding hadn't been about power. It had been about recognition, delayed by 11 months and a change of hair color and a diner uniform that made a decorated medic invisible. He hadn't recognized her the day of the shooting because he hadn't looked at her face. Waitresses were furniture to men like Rico. Background noise in a room, he was busy scanning for real threats. He'd recognized her at the wedding, in a dress instead of an apron, standing still instead of moving through a room, holding herself with the particular posture of someone who has stood at attention more times than she stood at ease, and the recognition had nearly stopped his heart. Dante didn't confront him immediately. He waited, watched, let Rico's own nerves start doing the work of exposing him. A canceled meeting here, a too eager offer to handle the wedding security personally there, a late night spent alone in the archive room, with a family kept records nobody was supposed to need twice. Elena, moving through the house now, with the quiet, deliberate attention of someone conducting reconnaissance rather than recovering from a wound, noticed all of it and reported none of it to anyone but Dante in low voices on the terrace after the baby was asleep. You knew, Dante finally said to Rico, standing over him in the compound study, the buried inquiry file open on the desk between them. The room lit only by a single lamp that threw long shadows across the family crest on the far wall. You knew the day she took that bullet from my daughter exactly who she was, and you said nothing. I said nothing because if the truth came out, it comes out that I built a cover story on a woman's ruined career to protect a unit that got 16 soldiers killed on my watch, Rico said, and for the first time in 11 years, Dante heard something in his cousin's voice that wasn't calculation. It was fear, raw and unpracticed, a sound that didn't belong in that room. I didn't know she'd end up in your kitchen. I didn't know she'd end up in your bed. I thought that story was buried with the 16 men it killed. She's not a story, Dante said. She's my wife, and you're going to sit very still while I decide what that means for you. For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might end there, contained and quiet, a family matter settled behind a closed door the way family matters in that house always were. But Rico had spent 3 weeks watching Elena's competence dismantle the version of events that kept him safe, and cornered men rarely choose the option that leaves them at someone else's mercy. He didn't move against Dante that night. He moved against the one thing he thought would silence Elena permanently before she could ever testify to what she knew about the cover-up. His daughter, the one piece of leverage guaranteed to put Elena exactly where he wanted her, paralyzed, choosing between exposure and silence. He should have remembered what Elena did the last time someone reached for that child. CTA, this is the moment. Don't skip ahead. Watch every second of it. The nursery at midnight was dim and warm, a single night light throwing soft amber across the crib rails, the air thick with the particular hush of a sleeping house. The man Rico sent moved through it with the confidence of someone who believed a waitress-turned-wife would freeze at the sight of a gun near a crib, the way most people do, the way the entire genre of men underestimating her had trained him to expect. A confidence built on every assumption she'd spent a year carefully cultivating. Elena didn't freeze. Elena had spent 3 years teaching her body to do exactly the opposite of freezing, and the reflex that used to make her drop coffee pots at loud noises had, somewhere in the last 11 months, quietly become something else entirely. Not fear anymore, but readiness wearing fear's old clothes, a disguise so complete it had fooled everyone in that house, including, for a while, herself. She came off the wall where she'd been standing sentry, silent and bare feet, the floorboards betraying nothing under a step she'd practiced 10,000 times in another life, and a scalpel she'd kept strapped to her thigh since the day she learned what family she'd married and it cleared its sheath before the intruder's gun had finished its turn toward the crib. She didn't hesitate over the geometry of it. Angle, artery, the same cold arithmetic that had once saved 16 men who never got to say thank you, and now, finally, saved one who would grow up never knowing how close it came. The man went down without firing a shot, a single controlled motion that left him disarmed and bleeding on the nursery rug before he'd finished processing that the furniture had moved. The nursery door slammed open a half-second later, Dante and Salvo and 3 armed men filling the frame, and found Elena standing over the intruder in a thin cotton nightgown, blood on her hands that wasn't hers, her daughter, hers now in every way that mattered, still asleep in the crib behind her, undisturbed by any of it, one small fist curled against her cheek. Salvo, who had spent 3 weeks suspecting her of being exactly this dangerous, said nothing. He simply, slowly, lowered his weapon and stepped aside, something like respect settling into the set of his shoulders where suspicion had lived before. "You could have called for help," Dante said. When he could speak, his voice rough with an adrenaline that hadn't caught up to the fact that the crisis was already over. "I don't miss twice," Elena said. Nobody in that hallway said another word for a long moment. It wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. CTA, that line's about to end up in every comment section this story ever gets. You heard it first. Dawn found the compound wide awake, Alvarez treating the intruder's wound before questioning began in earnest in a room Elena wasn't invited into and didn't ask about. By the time the sun was fully up, they had a name, and the name led, with the grim inevitability everyone in that hallway had already half expected, back to Rico. The reckoning happened that morning, in front of the full family. The buried inquiry file laid open on the same table where Dante had married her 3 weeks earlier, the champagne glasses long since cleared away and replaced with something far colder. Dante did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The whole room had already gone silent the moment he walked in with the file under his arm and Elena, steady and unflinching, at his side. 16 men died because you needed a name to sign onto a report, Dante said. You found one. You let her carry that for 3 years, so your career survived instead of hers. And when that wasn't enough to keep you safe, you sent a man into my daughter's nursery. Dante, you don't run operations for this family anymore. You don't sit at this table. You will spend the rest of your life exactly as invisible as you made her, and you'll have every year of it to think about whether that was worth what it cost. Dante closed the file. Get out of my house. Rico left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the specific, permanent knowledge that the woman he'd once reduced to a signature line on a cover story had, in the space of a month, become untouchable in every way that mattered, and that the 16 names on the file he'd buried would follow him out the door whether he acknowledged them or not. In the days after, the compound settled into a quiet that felt, for the first time since the diner, less like a fortress bracing for the next attack, and more like something that might, eventually, be allowed to feel like a home. Word traveled fast through the families who mattered. The story of the waitress who was never just a waitress, of the wife who'd ended a threat in her bare feet before her husband's men had even cleared the stairs, and whatever calculations Cassano had been running about Marchetti's vulnerability quietly, permanently, stopped. CTA, you thought the danger ended with Rico. It did. What's left now is just the part nobody warns you is coming. Learning how to live after. Dawn came up gold and cold over the compound's terrace 3 days later. The kind of morning that made the whole ugly winter feel briefly survivable, frost silvering the lawn below in a way that looked, for once, decorative instead of ominous. Elena stood at the railing with the baby warm and awake against her shoulder, the child's small fist curled around the fabric of her coat, and Dante came up behind her without a word, unpinning something small and heavy from inside his jacket. It wasn't a wedding ring. It was the Marchetti family signet, the seal that marked not a wife by ceremony, but a protector by right, worn only by those the family had chosen to trust with everything, including its silence. A mark that outranked any vow spoken in front of 40 armed men in a rushed ceremony 3 weeks prior. He pinned it to her collar in front of the men gathered below on the lawn, and said, loud enough for the whole assembled family to hear, that the woman standing at that railing with his daughter in her arms had earned her place in this house the day she stepped in front of a bullet meant for someone else, and every day since. Not because she'd been claimed, but because she'd chosen, over and over, in a diner and a clinic and a midnight nursery, to stand exactly where the danger was. Elena looked down at the ring, then at the sleeping, now stirring, now blinking sleepily up at her child, then at the man who had turned a tactical marriage into something neither of them had planned on needing. So, she said, what happens next time someone underestimates me? Somewhere below, on the lawn, Salvo laughed for the first time anyone could remember, a short, startled bark of a sound that made 2 of the younger guards jump. Next time, Dante said, I think I'll just watch. There was, in the days between the wedding and the reveal in Alvarez's clinic, a night that Elena would later understand as the moment the story could have gone a different way entirely. The night suspicion first landed, wrongly, on someone else. It happened at a dinner meant to smooth relations with an allied family, the Doyles, whose patriarch had flown in from the coast with his son Marcus in tow, a young man with an easy smile and an unsettling habit of asking Elena questions that circled a little too close to things she hadn't told anyone. How long had she worked at the diner? Had she ever traveled overseas? Did she have family who might come looking for her now that her name was in the papers? None of it rose to the surface of the conversation itself. Elena simply logged it the way she logged everything, filing Marcus Doyle under a heading she didn't yet have a name for, watching the way his questions never quite matched the rhythm of ordinary small talk. By the second course, Salvo had noticed it too. By dessert, he'd positioned himself close enough to the young man's chair to make clear, without a word, that any further questions would be answered by someone other than Elena. He's fishing, Salvo murmured to Dante later that night, once the Doyles had gone. Question is whether he's fishing for his father or for himself. For 2 tense days, suspicion tightened around Marcus Doyle, a man with motive enough, ambition enough, and a father whose alliance with the Marchettis had always been more convenience than loyalty. Dante had his people quietly trace Marcus's movements the week of the shooting, cross-referencing flights and phone records, looking for the thread that would make the case close cleanly. It didn't close. Marcus Doyle, it turned out, had been 3 states away the day the shooter walked into that diner, and his interest in Elena's past had a far more mundane explanation. He'd recognized something in her bearing that reminded him of an aunt who'd served overseas and had been clumsily, badly, trying to make conversation about it. The false lead cost them 2 days and very nearly cost the Doyle alliance its goodwill, a reminder to everyone in that house that certainty earned too easily was usually certainty earned wrong. It was only after that dead end, restless and frustrated, that Dante had gone looking harder at the people closer home, and it was that widened search, born out of a wrong answer instead of a right one, that eventually led back to the inquiry file gathering dust in the family archive, and from there, inevitably, to Rico. CTA, you almost got the wrong villain there, too. This genre trains you to expect the easy answer. This story doesn't give you one. In the quiet that followed Rico's departure, Elena found herself, for the first time in 3 years, sleeping through the night without waking at every sound the old house made settling into its foundations. She still flinched at loud noises. Some things didn't unlearn themselves just because the danger had passed, but the flinch had stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a language she was allowed to speak openly now, in a house full of people who understood exactly what it had cost her to learn it. Salvo, in the weeks after, took to greeting her each morning with a short nod that had replaced his old, watchful silence. Not quite friendship, but something adjacent to it, the particular respect one professional affords another once the doubting is done. Marisol started leaving 2 extra pieces of bread on her tray instead of 1, and never explained why, and Elena never asked. Alvarez, for his part, filed a new set of medical notes in his cabinet of secrets, this time with Elena's full knowledge and half her editing, a record that finally told the truth about a triage decision that had never been hers to answer for, sealed somewhere Rico could never reach it again. And Dante, in ways neither of them announced to the rest of the family, began treating the terrace at dusk as something closer to a ritual than habit, 2 chairs instead of 1 waiting there most evenings, a blanket for the baby folded over the railing, the quiet, ordinary architecture of a life neither of them had expected to be building when a diner door chimed on an unremarkable afternoon 11 months and 1 bullet ago. If you've ever been the one nobody thought to watch closely, you already know exactly how this story ends for the people who made that mistake.